So I went to my pastor. I spilled my guts. He said, "This is as clear as mud, but this is what I can see you doing." And he actually spoke what I believe was a prophetic word over me.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Valor Vision Podcast today. I am really excited about this episode specifically because one, it's going to be our Valentine's Day edition, and our first female guest on the Valor Vision Podcast, Constance here. And so I'm excited to talk about this and what she relates into. Absolutely, I've gone through and have dealt with in my life, and so many other people have dealt with this inside the church, outside the church, and everything. And so we're going to be diving into that. But absolutely, make sure to subscribe and click that like button and all that kind of good stuff on here. But we are going to have a great time diving into this. But let me give you a bio for Constance here. And Constance Hastings brings an outsider's voice to a story insiders think they may know, which I kind of love that. Raised without religion, shaped by the church, and working as a mental health counselor, that she got her degree from Wilmington University and a master's in community counseling. And beyond it, she speaks to those wrestling with meaning inside and outside of the faith. And so this podcast is going to confront the trouble that Jesus caused, right? The trouble that Jesus has. That's part of her website as well. And so we're going to have that also in the description below. Make sure to check that out on her website. The questions we avoid and why one of history's most controversial figures still matters. She's been married for 47 years, coming up this April, which is also my anniversary. So that's awesome. Anniversary's in April. She has a stepdaughter that's 57, a son 44, and a grandson 14, and of course, plenty of other extended family who call the East Coast and Wilmington, Delaware home. Constance, welcome onto the show.
Great to be here, Nick.
And so, this is one of those, you've dealt with both people that deal with kind of being on the fringe of their faith, or even if they have faith, the skepticism and things like that. But then also the part I'm really excited to talk to you about is those that have been, we call it church hurt, that terminology, which of course in reality, I say that a person hurt you, or maybe a couple of people hurt you, that really we're all sinners in need of grace and in need of a savior, whatever the title is that you have. But that still doesn't take away the pain that has happened to people, and that you deal with that quite a bit. But before we even get to that part, I really want to know, who is Constance, like the person, right? We know you're a counselor. We know you deal with all of these special topics and everything, but what brought you into that? What brought you into that realm of your life? Like how did Constance come to, one, know faith, and then see where this was a need in our faith circles?
Well, Nick, I sometimes say I shouldn't be here today. As you said, I was raised in a non-religious home. But for all the wrong reasons, my parents sent me to an independent, small Christian school. And the reason they did that, and why I say it was for all the wrong reasons, is it was a time when the schools were desegregating, and they thought I would be safe there rather than being caught up in that. However, the teachers there in that school, they loved me, they embraced me, even though I was a different child or came from a different place. Most of my classmates' parents were pastors or even missionaries, and my dad owned a bar. But that wasn't consequential to them. And in that wonderful love that they gave me, I excelled at Bible study. I tell people I even won the Bible Bee twice, and it was just a part of me. But as far as my salvation experience was, because they had taught me so well at a very young age, one time, it was actually on a Good Friday, and someone had taken me to the movies to see the film King of Kings. And that night in my bed, I felt so responsible for Jesus having to die for my sins. And so on my knees, I prayed that he would forgive me for that. And I actually had a physical experience of this burden being lifted from me. Years later, I would read Pilgrim's Progress.
Mhm.
And that's what happened to Pilgrim as he stood at the cross in his repentance. This burden of sin fell away. And that's when I knew, and I could point to that as my salvation experience. But again, I wasn't in a religious home, and I didn't have a strong church family to surround me as I was growing up outside the school. And so it was that I had belief. My mother took me to church until I was old enough to drop me off at the door, kind of thing. And I stayed and I was part of that, but it wasn't my home life. And of course, there were conflicts and differences. Not that I was in a place where I wasn't loved and cared for, but I just knew that there was a difference and a significant difference. When I graduated from college, I had a degree in English and I got a job teaching where my department chair was a pastor's son. And when we began dating, of course, he wanted me to go to church with him. And I walked in and I knew those scriptures. I knew those hymns. I could enter into that life. And it was there that my faith began to grow and be challenged. It took, I don't know, 20 years before I actually felt that there was a call on my life to enter into something that was more ministry related other than a good Christian life that I was living and teaching in. And that's when I felt the call to enter into faith-based counseling and I had an 18-year practice there. I learned so much during that time. You have to understand when God called me into that, I left a profession of teaching where I knew all the answers.
Mm.
I was in a place where I was very confident in what I did. I received an Excellence in Teaching Award. And then I went into this space where people were coming to me with all different kinds of issues and problems. And yes, I had a good education in that, but nothing prepares you until you're just sitting in that chair and people are spilling their stories and the worst that life could bring to them. There were times when I would sit across from clients and the only thing I could give them, but probably the best thing, was prayer. And I was so grateful for that. I would say to myself, how do people do this otherwise? That was where I belonged at the time. However, as the years went on, my husband asked if I would retire and for us to move closer to where our son lived. I agreed, but I had a stipulation. Both of them, I told them, I have this book that I feel called to write. And I hadn't been able to do it because I was so busy otherwise. I said, you've got to give me time and space to do that. And they did. So 3 weeks after we moved, I still had boxes, piled up around my desk of things that needed to be unpacked. But I sat down and began to write this book, which ultimately became The Trouble with Jesus: Considerations Before You Walk Away.
Now, I take it, I thought I heard you have that book right next to you, don't you?
Mhm.
So I want to see that. I love the cover of this book alone,
There you
right?
go.
I know we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but I'm telling you, like, I love the cover on there. And we had a nice conversation about that, which is really, really cool. But what was, n- so I want to back up a little bit. You said something that kind of captivated you. You said it took you about 20 years to kind of realize that there was a calling on your life. Was that just something that developed over time, or were there specific things that went on in those 20 years that were like pivotal moments that built
Well,
into that calling?
one thing that needed to happen was I'd never been baptized.
Well, yeah, that's a good one. We need to do that.
You understand what happened. My parents never suggested it. They never took me to church as a child or as a young person. It was not on the table. And the other part of that was, see, not growing up in a strong church family, as I said, and being among the workings of a church, I didn't feel the connection for that part of
Mm,
church. Certainly belief and knowing Jesus as your savior and as the son of God was primary. But beyond that, it wasn't. And as it turned out, I was baptized when my son, and I thought, okay, I've done my part, and we'll go from there. But um, I never officially joined the church. I never put my name on that list of official members and that kind of thing until, and this was a significant part. As I describe it, the Holy Spirit just grabbed me by the throat, and I was convicted that I needed to join the church. Now, this was during the time of Lent, and during the week before Easter, reading through the Gospels and Jesus' crucifixion story. He goes before Pilate, and Pilate said to him, your religious leaders brought you here. And I thought, if Jesus would continue to be part of his faith traditions and participate in the festivals and teach in the synagogues and the temple, then how can I refuse to join mine? And so I agreed to do so, thinking again, the Holy Spirit would just sort of fade away and life would go on. But it just intensified. And that's when I felt that call to really seriously look at this and enter into that. So I went to my pastor. I spilled my guts. He said, this is as clear as mud, but this is what I can see you doing. And he actually spoke what I believe was a prophetic word over me. And within 5 years, getting the education and becoming part of this counseling practice is exactly what happened. And shouldn't be here today, Nick. God brought me here.
I would say most people that are truly following the Lord, and the Lord's path for us is not anything close to what we ever would have dreamt of for ourselves.
No.
And so that is a common thing, but always done differently for everybody else, right? And it's also amazing. So, but kind of talking to you about this book, the book has an edgy, challenging voice to Jesus and his story and his message. But who is that voice? Where does that come from? What is that brought you to say, I'm going to bring this out? Because we see a lot of, I think, in our normal church, vision of who Jesus is, it's flowery and comforting a lot of times. And then every once in a while we'll pull out, well, Jesus flipped tables, so don't forget about that. But most of the time he's cuddling lambs and healing the sick and doing things like that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
this is a little bit more raw of who Jesus is.
We prefer to keep Jesus meek and mild, don't we?
Yeah.
Okay. But again, as God positioned me as I was growing up, and certainly through college, and even as I was teaching, I would hear these voices and these questions that would arise from there. And certainly today, with the world, the culture, the social media, these kinds of questions come up. And I began to sort of hear them. Excuse me, it wasn't like an audible thing, but in my mind, it began to form that there were these places of pushback against Jesus, how people had raised obstacles. And, where was the answer to which they would listen? And what I realized is that skeptic, that doubter, needed to be given voice before it could be answered. And so that's how that occurred. May I, just for a second, I want to read to you the very first paragraph of the book.
No, absolutely.
Now, let's be clear about this. You can tell your story any way you see it, and I can jump in with my 2-bit commentary when I want. But none of this, believe it or you're going to burn crap. I'm only willing to listen because I agree Jesus' story might have some things I like about it, but it's my choice what I do with it. I've been given other belief systems about the universe, how we got here, and what it means to pass through this life. I guess so that I think there's more. And I'm willing to give Jesus the benefit of the doubt. And doubt is what I bring to this table. And that voice goes through and is challenging and interruptive. on the narration. Sometimes it's angry, sometimes it's sarcastic, sometimes it's crying out. But it comes up in different places, and it's not regular, so it's not always expected, but speaks into certain things that we know about Jesus, maybe in a way that we hadn't thought of before. In that regard, um, it's challenging to believers as well. Now, I do want to clarify. As I said, it is edgy.
Hmm.
It's not profane. Okay, so it's not profane, but it may give people who are believers sort of a pause. So it's like, oh, I wish you hadn't said it that way. So that's the perspective of the book and the structure of the book in that regard.
No, but that's why I wanted you on here, is because that's what this podcast is all about. I'm not here to fluff up your traditional mindset. I'm here to challenge it. This is to bring in the reality of our faith, and that faith is real, but we have to get to the reality of who Jesus is. And when we paint him as always cuddling lambs and walking through meadows and just like making people joyful all the time, that does a disservice to the other part of the gospel messages that are written, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A lot of them talk about how the Pharisees went after him. A lot of them talk about the ruggedness of who he is. There's so much more than just the flowery side that we see. And so if we just coddle to that all the time, then we're going to miss so much of the truth and the ruggedness of who Christ is. And we need that, right? We need that part of realizing that he's not just the Lamb of God, but he's also a warrior. He's also the one that is there, right? How can somebody that's just cuddling lambs all day protect me? I want the protector of Christ as well. I need the one that's going to give me strength because he already is strength, and things of that nature. And so that's why I can't wait to dive into this book even more myself personally. So I've got it on here, and I'm looking forward to like into it more. And I love that beginning paragraph of this. And so bringing the reality of that in there is huge. I know you talk to like people that are skeptical, but then also people that have been of faith and then they were challenged or otherwise hurt by some aspect in their religious life, in their life as a Christian. At some point some church did something and made them, and we see this nowadays, everyone basically dissecting their faith to the point of dismantling it altogether. And what would you say to people like that and what have you seen so far with people that have gone through these painful traumatic issues?
So I've talked to people who have been, we'll just call it abused by the church, and as well those who are deconstructing faith. And this is my counseling practice here. You need to get into what they are carrying in that regard. One time I was working with a group of teenagers, and one boy, unfortunately, in the group, his mother was very angry with him and took him to church to have um, the pastor beat the devil out of him.
Mm,
I just hurt for him so much. And yet, regardless of what I would have said, seeing me hurt by his hurt, I think helped him see that no, this is not the God that we worship. This is not the God who loves you. And to help him come to a place of relearning, if you will, and allowing God to heal him of that. But the other side of it, and I think this, yes, a lot of people point to the church and say, well, look at what the church did, and they can, fish up what they want out of that. On the other hand, the people who are in that deconstruction phase, more often than not, I find underlying that is a need that goes all the way back to the beginning of where the serpent came to the woman and lied to her by saying, eat of this fruit, you will not die. You will be like God. To
mm,
be like God, to have that control, to make God into who I want God to be is a real part of this, um, of this, what am I going to say, of this pushback.
Hmm.
A couple weeks ago, I was at a book festival, and this man was walking by, and he saw the book, and I could tell something was going on, and I said to him, "Wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Let me talk to you about that." And I very briefly told him about the book, and he said, "Well, I'm an atheist." He said, "At one time, I did go on this, what he would call a spiritual journey, seeking God and trying to find that."
Hmm.
But he described this experience that he had. And he said, "I was there in this one place." He said, "It only happened to me once. And there was this light that came." And he said, I've never felt like that before. And I don't know how to explain it." And I said to him, "You had this feeling. Was it a feeling of peace?" The look that came on his face, it was like he'd never been able to put a name to it. And he said, "Yes." And I said, "That peace was of Christ." And again, he wouldn't go there immediately, but I could see that concept entering into him. And he walked away. I've been praying for him since. But that's what I think happens here, is that he was on a spiritual journey to find God. And I had expressed to him that you can go look for God all you want, but God is the one who's going to find you. And that's hard for a lot of people in the world who want to put God in a box and make God into what they believe God should be for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's the human heart condition. I think that we all want to be Saul. Maybe we don't want it, but it's a natural thing that, I kind of talk a lot of the heart posture between Saul and David. David was a man after God's own heart. Saul was a man that wanted God after his own heart. The way that he operated, the way his relationship was with God was almost, need you to be the genie in the bottle. And when I rub the lamp, you come out and then you do the thing that makes me successful. And that was Saul's mentality throughout a lot of it. And then we see the difference was David, whenever he prayed, was, Lord, is this what you want me to do? If it's not, I won't do it. Throughout the majority of that was his primary heart posture. And we gotta be careful because it's too easy, and we see a lot of the messaging too of God's gonna pop out and just make your life perfect, and it's like, no, that's not the truth, is that we're here. God does amazing things in our life, and God cares for you and loves you and will do a lot of great things. But the purpose is not to make you happy. The purpose is for you to see his glory and for you to turn around and worship him. He's the one worthy of worship, not ourselves. We're made in his image, not the other way around. And too often that's the misunderstanding. And then people get hurt when that mentality shift is flipped upside down sometimes. And people, oh, God's supposed to love me, so nothing bad should happen in church. No, there's still broken people in church. That's like going to a hospital and saying there's no sick people.
Let's take that sense of brokenness.
Mhm.
When Jesus fed the 5,000, and let's remember that that's the only miracle outside the resurrection that is in all four of the Gospels. And so the teacher part of me would say, okay, if something gets repeated, it's going to show up on the test. So learn
Yeah.
it. And in all four of the Gospels, when the disciples come to Jesus and say, we've got to do something. All these people are here and they're hungry. And Jesus says to them, you give them something to eat.
Mhm.
And they go, okay, well, all we got are the, few barley loaves and a couple of fish. But in the Gospels, it says that Jesus took them, blessed them, broke the bread, and gave it to them. And that likewise happens to us, that when we are blessed, expect to be broken,
Mm.
because you are going to be broken so you can be given. Now, again, that's not something that's going to sell a lot, but it's really the truth,
It is.
to help people in those broken places begin to take the perspective, okay, things are changing, and they're changing in me or my family or my life situation, maybe my purpose. But it's not to be something that is for which we blame God, but to seek God's purpose in bringing us to that. As I said, when I left teaching and went into counseling, and I was like, what am I doing here? It takes a long time to be able to see that and to bring that about. But in those hard places is when God is most going to move us. And so we are going to be given for his purposes.
Hmm. I was wondering, I've never written a book. I've thought about it, or somebody said you should write about whatever. And I think the idea of writing a book is first very daunting and scary. Definitely when English was not your primary subject in school. I mean, school was never my primary subject at all, all of school. So, but for me to sit here and go, man, writing a book, like, and I think there's automatically a level of high respect for anybody that is able to do that and sit down and truly put that in. When writing this kind of book, what were some of the longest or hardest parts for you to go through a journey? Because this is something very personal. This is faith. This is really researching about who Christ is, the ups and downs, the reality of who he is, and things like that. But that can even challenge your own perceptions that you originally had of who Jesus was. So, what were some of the hard and long parts that was just like, oh, this is grinding?
There were a couple things. One of the chapters, and I think we've sort of alluded to this, is the trouble with Jesus was he refused to be the divine fixer. And often, we're all guilty of this, often in our prayers, we tell God what God is supposed to do. And that even happened in the Gospels. I think it's John 11, where Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, has passed away. Mary and Martha had sent word to Jesus 4 days earlier. He's sick. You got to come. They believed in his healing powers, and Jesus refused to come until after Lazarus had died. So when he shows up, Martha goes to him and says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It's an accusation. And then she says to him, but I know your father will do whatever you ask of him.
Hmm.
She's telling the Son of God what to do. And yet, maybe not as bluntly, but certainly in our prayers, we do that. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pray for, the troubles in our life and those who certainly do need prayer. But the hardest prayer to honestly pray is thy will be done. And that, I think, is where a lot of us live and have to go back to, and to remember that this is all in God's hands, God's plans, God's vision, not ours. And we are to come into that. Now, of course, with Lazarus, we know the story. Jesus called him forth and he came out of the grave and he lived and all seemed well. But before he did that, the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. If you go back to the original Greek, it says that Jesus was deeply troubled. But deeply troubled, the words that he used in the Greek are he was very angry. Why was Jesus so angry that he cried? Now, I know we don't like to look at that passage that way. We like to think, again, Jesus, compassion. He understands what we lived through. He knows our grief. I won't deny any of that. Keep that there. But that's kind of like the top layer of it. If you go deeper into it, you see that he is very upset. And yes, Lazarus does come out of the grave, and it's all to show who he is as the Son of God. Well and good. He's the Messiah. Let's go with that. Read
Hmm.
the rest of the chapter, though, because it is in the rest of the chapter that we see the Pharisees begin to plot his death. And even the high priest says it is fitting that one man should die for the nation, a prophetic word, definitely. But you see why Jesus was crying? They didn't to be the Messiah, the Son of God, who would save people and change their hearts. They wanted him to be the Messiah who would change their world. And the world will be changed by changed hearts, but not, A to B, if you will, a direct line necessarily.
Right. No, that's definitely the human condition. I want everything else around me to change, but me to maintain in my comfort.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's go to your comfort zone. The,
Oh,
se-
mine? Oh, no.
the second part that was hard to write were the in the latter chapters, I deal with people who had known doubt
Mm,
in the Gospels. And, there was Thomas.
mhm,
Okay. We're all familiar with him. But then there was also the man, I believe it's in Mark 9, that came to Jesus, and his son was having what today we would see as seizures. And he says to Jesus, "Will you heal him if you can?" And Jesus turned to him and says, "If I can."
mhm.
And then the man gives a response, and I think it's the most candid response in the entire Bible. He says, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief."
Yeah, yeah.
And we live that. We live that. Yes, I believe God can do anything, but will he? And we live in that tension, if you will, of belief and doubt. But the most impactful story of doubt, I believe, is with John the Baptist. John the Baptist, the son of Elizabeth, Jesus' cousin. Apparently, they may have grown up together, but it was to John that Jesus came and was baptized. And the revelation, "This is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased," was presented to Jesus and sort of confirmed what would be his destiny. John knew that. John was well on board. But when John was sitting in the pit of Herod's jail, and it didn't look good for John. So it was that he sent his followers to Jesus and with the question, "Are you really the Messiah?" How could John even go there? And yet that's where he sat, in this place of doubt and not wanting to know for sure if this was going to be. And Jesus responds to him. He said, you know what you've seen. And he begins to quote Isaiah, the blind will see, the deaf will hear, et cetera, lame will walk. Wonderful. But Jesus leaves out one line, which John would have known: the captives will be released. And then he says, "But blessed are those who don't take offense in me, who allow me to be the God that I am." I'm paraphrasing there.
Mhm.
And gosh, Jesus, I see what you're saying with John, but are you going to put me there too? Are you going to drag me through some kind of pit to where I come to a place where I'm not even sure I know who you are? That's a real wrestle. And that
Yeah.
was hard to write.
Yeah, because the other part is John is beheaded right after that.
Yeah,
And, there's just this level of, like, we have to realize that we see in the Gospels that, number 1, not everyone's healed
that's true.
and not everyone's set free on this earthly means. And I think that that's a big part that we have to realize that not everyone's healed on this side of heaven, and not everyone is set free on this side of heaven. When we talk about, like, being in jail or prison or something, but you're set free in your heart, right? Christ has taken on your sin and shame and all of that on the cross. But so we're set free by that, but you may still have to pay a life sentence in jail. John was unfortunately that was his final hours kind of deal. And so those are hard, and they're hard for us to remember some of that because we think that everybody's going to get healed. It messes with our theology, but guess what? We all will, but maybe not within our living on earth side of
Yeah.
our life. And so, in writing this book, what other lessons do you think really popped out in teaching you about your faith? Other than some of these, is there more? I'm sure there's more than just some of this, like, harsh reality.
True confession here. I finished the manuscript and I chose an editor who was a skeptic.
Mm,
She had been in church, all the youth group stuffs all through college, that sort of thing. I'd actually gone to seminary and then walked away. And I said, "Okay, you're the one I want to read this manuscript. I want you to tell me if this voice rings true." And after she read it, I asked her again. She said, "Yes, it does." She said, "Particularly in the latter chapters, there are some places in the narration where I also read those doubts." And I went, "My goodness, Those are my doubts, my questions. And so in writing the book, it helped me confront some of that as well. I had to go back and do a little revision, but it was a blessing in that way. And what I want all your listeners to know is yes, we all have that time in those places. And there are going to be things that I sometimes ask God, I pray for this all the time. You know my heart in it, but am I not going to see this side of heaven?
Hmm.
To come to that, not acceptance and that I won't pray for it anymore, but I have to believe in God's own time that will come according to his will.
Yeah. No, and I think it reminds me of what Jesus said after presenting his wounds to Thomas, right? Thomas, of course, is like the one that doesn't see Jesus, doesn't get to sit down and eat with him, doesn't see him just appear in a room and all of that kind of stuff. And he's like, I don't believe it until I see it. And Jesus appears, presents his wounds, allows him to touch his side. But then he looks at him and goes, you believe because you have seen. Blessed are those who believe yet have not seen.
Absolutely.
And so it's not to condemn those that need evidence, though. And here's like my point to that is that Jesus, if Jesus wanted you to believe with zero evidence, he would have never presented his wounds to Thomas. And so there's nothing wrong with wanting evidence. But there's also a level of those that do believe without doing apologetics and doing all of these other things, that there's a blessing for you that believe there. But if you need that, Jesus will still present that. Jesus will still present that, and there's nothing wrong with that. Um, and I think that that's part of like the goodness of who Christ is that not only do we get to believe because we experience Him, or we get to experience the truth of what the Bible says, and it's happening in my life, and my heart's changed, and all of that. But I'm also a person that loves all of the apologetic side of the evidence for our faith, the evidence for Christ, the evidence for the gospels, and looking at all of that as well. And there's nothing wrong with that. And so I think that that's a guy thing. I think we see a lot of apologetics being more an attractive thing for men. I think men need to see this kind of level of, I need the evidence for this.
Right. Yeah,
Right.
interestingly, for some reason, I've never read until now, I'm reading it, C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity.
Mm,
And you should take a look at that because he starts with this sense of not, he doesn't even start with God. He starts with our own human sense of, yeah, there's right and there's wrong. And then he deductively comes to that and into Christianity and into who Christ is. And it's very smooth and it's almost very, actually, I think it began as a radio interview. So it's sort of conversational in style and easy to read. But whoop, and it was one of those things where you read it and it's like, why didn't I read this 30 years ago? So
yeah.
I would recommend that if you need that
No,
evidence.
I'd love to. I like some of C.S. Lewis's stuff, and then but I haven't read that one. I'd say the apologetic book that absolutely just floored me was The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. Lee
Gold
Strobel,
standard, the gold standard.
absolutely.
Definitely.
And
Yes.
so don't just watch, I'm going to tell my viewer, like, do not just watch the movie. The movie just gives you the storyline. It doesn't, and it only highlights some of the evidence. The book itself goes into so much more detail and really goes straight into like his interviews with all these people. It's a phenomenal read.
And
Phenomenal.
I use that as a reference in my book,
Okay.
like a suggested reading list. You know,
Hmm.
that's one of them.
That's awesome. So when, as a counselor, sitting down with different people, whether they're skeptics or there's somebody that has deconstructed their faith due to pain or whatever, what are some of like the differences you see between men and women as they process these types of thoughts?
I think you've brought up some of that men are compartmentalized and they want to see the evidence and they
Mhm.
want to see progress. Men prefer for things to be fixed. And I really see this a lot in my son and my son-in-law. If there's a problem, they want to fix it. Which there's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't always happen that way. Whereas women are more attuned to coming alongside someone in their pain and, to walk through them in that. And, but I think we all could learn a lot of both in that regard. And it's not that one is wrong or whatever, but probably just, our own psychological makeup in that
Mhm.
way.
Yeah, no, and that's usually one of the issues that married couples can get into, right? The wife wants to come home and she's like, "Oh, let me tell you about this and that," and the husband after work is just like, the moment he hears of whatever she's dealing with is, "Well, you just need to do this to fix it. You should just call that person up and tell them, whatever, or do this." And then she gets frustrated, and why? Because she doesn't want an answer. She just wants you to get heard. She just wants you to be that, "It's okay, honey. Let me put my arm around you. Like, I understand. I feel your pain," and, all of that kind of stuff, and present 0 fix. And to us, that's like, I don't go to my friend to be like, "I just need to be heard today." Like, no, bro, what should I do? I can't figure out this problem. And and it's like, "Oh, man, you should do." "Oh, thanks, dude. Okay, cool." And it's like, well, you presented a fix because you heard my problem. And that's how men think about it quite often. And yeah, so but I think the other part of it is that there is, like you said, there's a balance of both. Is that this faith is a journey, and going through the journey, through the hand holding, through the arm around one's shoulder, discipling and being there for one another through the ups and the downs, we see the fixes and we see God at work and we see the evidence and we see the miracles and we see all of those happening if we give it time and walk through it together. I just see it as both. It is like the late, I just need somebody to walk through life with me. And guys are like, I just need somebody with tools that can fix it. Right. Well, it's both. Let's walk through life and God will show you the tools that he's using to fix your life if you take the time to walk through it, you know?
Definitely.
So it's definitely a little of both. How do you see that churches can be more of a safe place than some of the things that were going on, like as we're seeing with people coming out and having these different church hurt, whatever? Maybe it's a pastor, maybe it's, a middle level ministry leader that does them wrong or whatever. What can churches do to start recognizing some of this and almost how do we get rid of this, if we will?
I think some churches, let me clarify that. Some churches are systemically toxic.
Mm,
And you've got to be careful about that in wanting control over congregations, and things of that nature. Yes, there needs to be oversight. There needs to be good administrative leadership, but not to the point of, leaning in some ways even to being cultish. And if you get that sense, go.
mhm,
You must go. On the other hand, as far as doubts and skepticism is concerned, I'm so glad you asked me this
mhm,
because they need to be addressed from the pulpit. I'm saying from the pulpit. Meek and mild Jesus could be there, but let's go deeper than meek and mild Jesus and look into these places where it's hard and the places where we don't always preach. You take coming out of Christmas. What's Christmas? Oh, it's all so beautiful and the pretty songs to sing. And there's a Christmas story, and the shepherds show up, and then the wise men, and there's a star, and all is well. Nobody ever preaches about how 2 years later, Herod, paranoid because these men had shown up, said they were looking for King of the Jews, sent in his soldiers and slaughters the baby boys in Bethlehem. And it's only because an angel warned Mary and Joseph that they left and escaped that.
mhm,
Now, the trouble with Jesus is that's what shows up, that there is going to be that which wants to wipe him out completely and to kill off any who might be served by him. Whoa. You put that out in your churches and you're going to have people then begin to sit up and look around and see where they are and what they see in themselves and their families, yes, and within the church and in the culture. But nobody ever talks. It's in my book. It's in my book, my gospel. Get people to talk about it.
Yeah, no, there was a lot, like, it's one of those, like, little quick blips, like, Herod wanted to off all the kids that were 2 years or younger, and, all the boys specifically, right? And then, that's when the angel's like, "Hey, you gotta go," and they flee to Egypt, and then just like, "Okay, that's hundreds, if not possibly thousands of children," and
And
it's
here's
wild.
another point that archaeolog- archaeolog- archaeologists have
Mhm,
tried to verify this story
mhm,
and find it in some ancient historical recordings outside the gospel and whatever. Very little can be found about it. Now, this would have been very traumatic.
mhm,
So why isn't it showing up anywhere, in that regard? And here's the thing. The ruling power, the victor, always controls the narrative. You can bet that story was suppressed. Only recently, I saw an interview about the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem.
mhm,
And apparently, right outside or very near there, they have found some remains of infant children. And they're beginning to think that maybe these were some of the children that were slaughtered there. And so that church has given them a burial place of honor for what happened.
yeah. Yeah, no, I have heard about that where it's a mass grave. Now the other part is, maybe I'm probably wrong with thousands, probably in hundreds, because Bethlehem was not like a major metropolis. You're right. It was somewhat of a smaller town still, even though that was the prophesied town that Christ would be born in. But yeah, it's still, like we look at it also, we got to realize the brutality of life back then was also off the charts compared to how we understand brutality of life. Like, right, we see of somebody getting beat up, that is newsworthy, right? Local news, maybe national, depending on the political circumstances, right? That becomes massive news to us. Back then, somebody getting beat up in the street was just a Tuesday. It was like, "Oh, man, okay, I'm gonna turn the other way. Somebody's getting beat up over there." And it's just like, whatever, right? It was like, I'm just gonna avoid that situation and move on, right? And so there's also a level of realizing the brutality of the natural everyday culture that they lived in, through that.
I've read that when the Nazis were developing their torture techniques,
Mhm.
they studied the Romans.
Yeah, I've heard of that a little bit. I haven't done a deep dive into that, but I've heard of a little bit that they looked into ancient cultures, and Romans were one of the primary ones because they did. They perfected the whole. I mean, crucifixion is still looked at as the absolute number 1 worst way to take somebody out. I look at also the story of Christ. Medical people, when you look at the evidence of what he went through, you know, first of all, the lashing that he got medically, it was almost a miracle alone that he made it to the cross itself. He was officially persecuted by Roman law, not Jewish law. Pontius Pilate said, "Fine, we're good to go." And so the 42 lashes doesn't hold up. That is a Jewish tradition that you have to stop at that. Romans were like, "We don't care." So it could have been 42 or more. So we have no idea actually how many. It could have been more, it could have stopped at that point. I know tradition still kind of holds that to that number relatively, but we just never know. And there's a part of that we gotta realize the brutality of life back then compared to nowadays where it's like, my God, like, we freak out at some of the smallest things compared to how people lived back then.
Yeah.
And so, man, this is dealing with some of the skepticism of people. And I've asked some of these questions before of like, how much evidence does it take for somebody to believe? Or even the other question I've heard from Frank Turek. He's a great Christian apologist, and he's written a couple books. And one of his questions I've heard him ask was, if you knew to the fact of 2 plus 2 is 4, like that level of there's no denying it, fact that Christ is the Messiah, that Christ is who he says he is, and everything, would you follow him? I've seen interviews of him actually still tell people, or that people told him no, that they would. And so it's not so much of an evidence problem in all reality, it's a heart problem.
Yes, and it goes back, as I said, to the serpent saying, "You will be like God." That is what people would want. And even as you said, if there could be absolute certainty that this is true and that this is what God is doing, there are still going to be those who, in the place in which they are, will walk away. But Jesus will let us walk away, but he never really leaves us. And that's the grace of God, that the grace of God will pursue us as long as we have soul. And, it's something that when we consider who's going to make it to heaven, I don't think we really will know until we get there and see what God is doing in the hearts and in the souls of people. And they have to have that experience
Mhm.
to be in that place and to be able to accept Christ and what God is doing through him.
No, absolutely, because I think that's hard for sometimes a theologian to think about. Well, we don't know who's really gonna get accepted, and it's like, yeah, you don't, because that is a heart posture thing between me and God. Have I really accepted him? Am I really following him? Of course, there will be fruit and evidence of that, but unfortunately, we've seen way too many people that can con their way through that as well and give
Yeah.
up false evidence to our own eyes. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, it really is, are you genuine in your faith? Are you genuinely trying to follow him to the best of your ability and believing and confessing that he is Lord? And that is something I can't tell by looking at somebody else. There may be evidence of that, but is it fake or not? And I don't know. Lord will ultimately have that. And so, but man, Constance, I want to thank you so much. Thank you for being on our Valentine's Day special as well, and
Uh,
our first female guest. So I've ordered your book. It hasn't come in yet, and I'm really looking forward to like diving into this. Tell us a little bit, where else can we find you? Where can we find this book as well? All of that kind of stuff.
The most direct way to find me is through my website, constancehastings.com. And the website is actually a companion blog to the book. Each week, a blog post will come out. It's about a 10-minute read. It has usually that skeptical, doubting voice in it, but deals with a more narrow focus passage where, of course, the book has broader themes in it. And you can subscribe, sign up for free. If you do subscribe, you'll receive a link with a promo code and you can get the book for 20% off. So that's my Valentine's gift for your listeners.
Awesome. Well, that's going to be all in the description below in here, no matter where you're listening to this podcast from. And so we're really looking forward to uh, seeing more of you. I'd love to have you back at another point and see what's going on and how things are going. I'd love to see also some other people, and I want to give my feedback a little bit on this book as I look into it even more so.
I'd appreciate that.
Already, I'm just telling you from the cover, I love the cover. So I know we shouldn't judge a book by a cover, but it's an awesome cover already. There it is. So I'm looking forward to reading that, and I'd love to give you some feedback on it and everything, and how I enjoy it and learn from it. And I'd love to hear from you, any of our viewers and everybody. If you read it, come back, write some comments on here for her to be able to hear that, or get a hold of her directly. All of that. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for being a part of the Valor and Vision podcast. Thank you, Constance, for coming on with us and being a guest on with us today. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone. Take care. God bless, and stay with your vision and have valor, meaning having courage in the face of adversity to go after that. Take care. God bless.